Welcome to the second day of this conference. 70 years after Bandung, challenges and struggles on the road to self-determination and South-South solidarity. We will have three panels today. The first panel, we have three distinguished speakers. Can I ask them to come to the podium, to the stage? I will start by just introducing them. We have Dr. Nimrod Zarq, who is Chief Research Officer on Climate and Development Forum in Africa at the Cape Town Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. We also have Dr. Dongo Samba Sylla from Senegal, who is Research Director for Africa at the International Development Economics Associates. And we also have Dr. Amali Bedagere, who is a senior researcher at the Bandanaka Center for International Studies. The panel this morning is titled Crisis Planning and Industrial Policy. We were hoping to have a keynote address by Professor Anil Jayantha, Deputy Minister of Finance, but unfortunately, due to an urgent commitment, he's unable to join us today. I think he was very keen to be here. In fact, he met with some of the visiting economists on Saturday and Sunday, but unfortunately, we won't get a chance to hear his perspective. So I think, which means we'll go on till about 11 a.m. with this panel, and we'll have a bit more time for discussion. It was, I think, a great start to the conference yesterday with a keynote address by Professor C.P. Chandrasekhar, followed by a panel with Aziz Salman Fall, Zun Zhu, Bruno De Conti, and Farwa Sial. I think it really set the stage in terms of, what the Bandung spirit was all about and what happened since, and the turn towards neoliberalism. And beyond that, the kind of violence that had been unleashed by imperialism, and the many challenges that we face today. So this panel, we hope to address the ongoing crisis, but also to start thinking about what can be done. We know that over half the developing world is in debt distress. Sri Lanka itself defaulted on its debt for the first time 3 years ago. And beyond that, we see an unraveling of the global order. Neoliberalism itself is in crisis, but changes in the global order don't come gently. It comes with great disruption and possibly violence as well. In this context, how do we shape our world? Some of the policies, some of the structures that would have allowed us to address a crisis like this itself was systematically dismantled, whether it's national planning, industrial policy, or even institutions like development banks. And it's in this kind of context, how can we move forward? What are some lessons from other parts of the world, and how should the world order, particularly for the global south, change to be able to address this huge shift in the world order? And we're going to start with Dr. Nimrod Zogh, who would hopefully enlighten us on what's been happening in Africa, particularly with respect to industrial policy. Recently, he was also part of a discussion here on the idea of forming a new development bank. But these questions of how do countries in the global south deal with what we have faced now. All of us are aware of the huge trade shock that has not only disrupted the world but undermined the very premises of neoliberal globalization. So I'd like to invite Dr. Nimrod Zogh to make his presentation.
Thank you very much. As the presentation is being loaded, I'd just like to say a very big thank you to the organizers of this conference. It really is a great pleasure and privilege to be able to present to you and share some thoughts and insights from the or about the African continent. Let me again, I think as we wait for the the technology to catch up with us, it might be worth talking a little bit about the Nelson Mandela School. Let me do a brief introduction. So, the Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance is based at the University of Cape Town in South Africa. However, it has an Africa-wide focus. So we focus on research and teaching, and our students come from a range of African countries. The school is also very active in the applied policy space. So we provide quite a lot of support to the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the school convenes an advisory council which supports some of the thinking about how to progress with regional trade and integration, with a very strong focus on what we would call production-led trade and investment-led trade. So, in other words, it's not a typical approach to trade and free trade areas where the emphasis is on that the barriers to trade are fundamentally about just lowering tariffs, but rather the emphasis is on saying that in order to trade, you need to produce, you need to invest and produce, and for African countries to trade more with each other, they need to produce more of the things that they demand and which they currently import from the rest of the world. Sorry, we seem to have lost the presentation again. Wonderful, thank you. Okay. Is it possible to put it into presentation mode and to go to the first slide? Great. Okay. Sorry, if you can go to the introductory slide, the very first slide, please. So, rather than addressing directly some of the immediate and pressing issues that were posed at the beginning of the session, how countries can extricate themselves from this debt crisis or debt distress that many find themselves in. I would like to take a step backwards in this presentation and just reflect on some issues around how we think about economic development, and in particular African economic development, and then the specifics of the current moment I am very happy to pick up on in the discussion. So somewhat provocatively, I've titled this presentation, How Perhaps Not to Think About African Economic Development. And I think the reason for that will become evident. It will become evident as soon as I figure out how to move to the... There we are. Great. Okay, so yesterday's session, I think, left me and perhaps many people feeling a bit unsettled and with kind of contradictory thoughts about, what this conjuncture where we're seeing a shift in the world from unipolarity to multipolarity. Is it an optimistic moment? Is it a pessimistic moment? And I'd like to offer some observations on how to think about that, where we are. So the first point to make is that as much as I think that it is, in the medium to long term, it is a welcome development that we are shifting from a hegemonic, a unipolar world to a multipolar world, I think it's also important to accept or to acknowledge that this shift offers no guarantees that automatically there will be developmental South-South cooperation and solidarity. I think this point was made by a couple of speakers. And I think that raises the question then of what kind of actions are necessary to contribute to building a form of South-South cooperation that is developmental and embodies solidarity. So it speaks to the relationship amongst countries of the global South. A second area of tension is that it raised for me the question of what is the right balance in, particularly for countries that are trying to mobilize development strategies. How do they deal with this tension between these very powerful external forces on the one hand and their own internal agency? And I think there is a risk of shifting into a mindset that says because we are in a world where there are these undeniable and very powerful external forces that countries underestimate their. If I could go back to the previous slide, please, and the full screen mode. I also love baby elephants. Who doesn't? One slide back, please. Great. So I guess I would caution against an excessive focus on external forces to the extent that it might run the risks of countries actually saying, well, there's nothing we can do in this very unfair global order, and we kind of need to wait for the world to become a fairer place, which we know is not necessarily going to happen, if ever. It also raises the question of, as countries strategize about their economic development, the extent to which there is a reliance on received wisdom that may be both conceptually and empirically weak, but is presented as common sense, as common sense ideas, and that sometimes these ideas can come both from what we might consider the right, but also parts of the left. And thirdly, that there is also a danger in an excessive focus on these external forces, that they can also become a justification for deflecting internal policy mistakes and domestic policy missteps. So I think this all holds implications for economic strategy at the national level. And from my limited couple of days so far in Sri Lanka, it's very evident to me that the political leadership, on the back of a very strong electoral mandate, has been charged with charting a new strategy. And the question one would raise then is, so what does one, kind of intellectuals, activists, what message does one convey? Is it that, how does it might assist to unduly focus on, only on the external, because that doesn't help in necessarily in saying, how can a country strategize, how can it mobilize resources for meaningful development. Next slide, please. So the points that I want to run through are actually based on a joint program that we run as the school with SOAS University of London, called Structural Change and Economic Development in Africa. And so in a sense, perhaps I'm using this audience as a guinea pig to convey some of those core ideas to a broader audience. So one of the first observations that we emphasize is that we need to be careful of excessive generalization and sweeping narratives, which sometimes can become cliches. And we know that there are many such cliches around the African continent and how it is conveyed. The second, and I think I've touched on this point, is that we need to be careful of, on the one hand, of excessive and uncritical pessimism, or what one might call impossibilism. And this is manifested, for instance, in the notorious cover of the Economist magazine some years back, where they said Africa is the hopeless continent. But at the same time, it's also dangerous to engage in another kind of generalizing narrative, which was prevalent particularly during the commodity boom of the 2010s, which was this kind of Africa rising narrative. And that was very much predicated on the fact that economic growth in various African countries was appeared to be very positive, but this was largely because of the commodity boom and the failure to structurally transform and diversify economies then left African and other countries very exposed when commodity prices fell, and combined with the COVID-19 crisis contributed very significantly to the combined debt and foreign exchange crises that many countries are currently facing. Keep on that slide, please. Thank you. So there's also an issue that is raised in conceptualizing ways of thinking about African economic development, which is an observation that there's sometimes a lack of attention to variation. And this is manifested itself often in the form of, this Africa as a country idea that does not give adequate attention to the differences between African countries on the one hand and even within African countries. And that lack of attention to variation is something that I would come back to, because paying attention to variation can be a very useful instrument in helping to strategize about what might be possible. There's also a tendency, and I think here this is where a trap that both, again, in inverted commas, some from the right and the left fall into, which is this idea that in order for progress to happen and development to take place, there are a certain set of preconditions. Some of them are neoliberal preconditions. There are other preconditions which are raised. Excuse me. So one set of preconditions is that before countries can develop, they need the right set of institutions, which are typically based on an idea of good governance and institutions that prevail largely in Western Anglo-American societies. And those include things like, you must have an independent central bank that adopts inflation targeting, need a certain set of property rights guarantees, certain kinds of financial institutions. Second is that you need the right geographic location. And this plays itself out in different ways. Some people say, well, if you're landlocked, you can't develop as a country. Well, Switzerland has done okay despite being landlocked. A third variant is that there has to be the right culture. And if there isn't the right culture, then again, development may not be possible. The fourth is you need the right geopolitical context. And I think this is one of the areas that are being discussed and debated here is, to what extent must this evolving new geopolitical order fit certain parameters before development is possible and before countries are able to strategize about their own development paths. Next slide, please. So this story about sweeping narratives, generalizations and cliches, I thought can be quite neatly illustrated by the series of covers from The Economist magazine over time. So in 2000, The Economist said Africa is the hopeless continent, doomed to failure. Then by 2011, and coinciding with the commodity boom, the slogan was Africa Rising. So I don't know what happened, how this hopeless continent, became suddenly Africa Rising. In 2013, they spoke of an aspiring Africa, and in 2019, they spoke of the new scramble for Africa, for minerals. Again, implying that the continent is subject to these forces, whether it's Western countries, Chinese, who are all scrambling to access the continent's resources, and the continent doesn't have any say in the matter in the terms according to which they will supply these countries with minerals. Next slide, please. So this is another example of sometimes widely accepted ideas about the continent, which have a questionable empirical basis. So one is this idea that Africa can't feed itself. This is partly based on that at least in certain periods, the exports of agricultural products from the continent are less than imports. But when one looks more closely, in general, countries are not African countries are not food importers. And there are only 4 countries that account for the continent's net food imports, which are Nigeria, Angola, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Somalia. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Again, what this demonstrates, the slide on GDP per capita amongst African countries, is that there is very wide variation in performance. And some countries have managed to grow per capita income quite considerably, while others have done less well. And that then raises the question, what have countries like say, Ethiopia and Rwanda done that have enabled them to make this kind of progress, and what lessons might there be for other African countries, in addition to lessons that might be absorbed from progress that has been made by countries elsewhere in the world. Next slide, please. So the kind of philosophy that I suppose that we espouse in this course is one which is very much informed by the great social scientist Albert Hirschman, who some of you may have heard of, and he coined this term possibilism. And the idea behind possibilism is it's neither naive optimism nor unwarranted skepticism or undue skepticism, but rather a skeptical and realistic bias towards hope, rooted in evidence and variation. And the importance of variation, once again, is that understanding those differences of experience can be important guides to what may be possible. Next slide. And I am wrapping up. Next slide, please. So this is captured in a very nice quote by Albert Hirschman, who says, "A country's prospects are not determined by what it is and what it has, but by what it does and what it becomes as a result of what it does." Thank you very much.
Next we'll have Dongo Sambasila from Senegal speaking to us.
Okay, I have some reference. So good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here in Sri Lanka among all of you, and to reflect on the legacy of the Bandung conference. I would like to thank the organizers for having brought me here and allowing me the space to discuss about this very important topic. So I have prepared some few slides as illustrations of my talk today, which is about Bandung and the linking project. And I would like to start with one image coming from the Economist magazine, because the Economist magazine has this very ironic title saying that how the Global South forgot its own birthday, because there have been very few events trying to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the Bandung Conference. But hopefully we are here to commemorate that with, interesting people here in Sri Lanka, and to try to build South-South solidarity. For me, the Bandung Conference has been a very important historical moment. Even a world-making event, if you were to use the concept of scholar Adam Getachew. It has been a high point of the revolt of the Third World against colonialism, imperialism, racism, and more generally about global white supremacy. What was important about the Bandung moment for me was also the interconnection between the different struggles. Because the significance of the Bandung Conference could not be assessed only by the very important principles that were put in the final declaration, but the whole process created, at this particular historical moment. For example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the decolonization happened really after the Bandung Conference, with Ghana becoming the first independent country in south of the Sahara, and after that many African countries obtained their independence. But I would like also to stress on the fact that there had been a unity of struggles, so that any victory somewhere across the global south, the third world at the time, was important in the other parts of the third world. For example, the Indochina War, the French were defeated, in Vietnam, Dien Bien Phu, 1954. This was something really important. For example, when you look at the so-called French colonies in sub-Saharan Africa, when the French were defeated, the French feared that there could be wars of liberation in Francophone Africa. So they said they didn't want to have other wars of liberation, because they were one, in Algeria. So they said, let's try to find a solution, and they began to, put the steps towards neocolonialism, new form of neocolonialism. And 1 year after Bandung, in the French Empire, you had universal suffrage for all these countries, because that was the way for France to appease the growing dissent within the empire. But still, in some parts of the French colonial empire, for example, in Cameroon, there had been a war waged against the most established, national liberation movement, the Union of the Population of Cameroon, between 1955 and the early 1970s. And tens of thousands of people were killed by the French silently, and this was only, known to a few people, until now. So at that particular historical moment, all these struggles were really interconnected, and victories in some place were really shaping, other struggles in other places. And what I would like also to say, next slide, is that the struggles by the communist movement and the third world, they have contributed to democratize the West. This is a point I really would like to make, because this is something really important, because generally we have been used to the idea that the West have always been democratic and they have been respecting human rights. In fact, they have been just respecting the human rights of the bourgeois to some extent, but not the women, not the working classes, not the minorities. And thanks to the struggles by the communist movement and the anti-colonial world, in fact, they were obliged to adjust and to recognize the rights, the humanness of those people who were excluded. Here you have a letter from the U.S. Department of Justice dated in 1952, which was sent to the Supreme Court. And you could see in that letter, and the Department of Justice said to the Supreme Court, normally you have this illusion of the separation between powers. And they were saying that if you say that discrimination is legal, this would be a huge victory for the people of the third world. And you have to say that discrimination is something illegal. Otherwise, we would lose our face. Next slide. And you have also another example, because Vice President Nixon at the time went to Africa in the early 1950s, and he met a lot of progressive leaders, and he made a report called The Emergence of Africa. And from this report, you could see that they were saying we could not talk equality to the people of Africa and Asia and practice inequality in the United States. In the national interest, as well as the moral issues involved, we must support necessary steps which will assure orderly progress toward elimination of discrimination in the United States. So that means that all this struggle, you had, civil rights movement in the U.S. and other parts, of the Americas and in the global South. These struggles would not have been successful without, the national liberation movements, the spirit of Bandung. So these anti-colonial movements, contributed to somehow democratize the West and push them to respect the human rights of other people. But what is also interesting about Bandung is that it also gave voice and international presence to those peoples and nations that were excluded from the mainly Euro-American conference in Bandung roots, because the economic and financial order after World War II was built in New Hampshire at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. But peoples, nations from Africa and from Asia, most of them were under colonial status and were not that sovereign, so they were not represented at that conference. It was only more than 10 years later in Bandung that these people would have, international presence, and they would claim, their right to exist, to be independent, to be sovereign, and also their need to change the world. And generally speaking, when we talk about the Bretton Woods Conference, Mr. Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, is seen as Mr. Nice Guy. But he had very racist quotes regarding, the Bretton Woods Conference. He used to say that it's the most monstrous monkey house assembled for years. Because for him, it was not legitimate that people, for example, in Latin America would be there talking about these topics like, the international finance system, etc. So this is a quote from Keynes. But this Bretton Woods Conference was a wartime gathering by allies, 1944. And it built the institutions we have, the international financial institutions we have. And this order is not democratic at all, because when we talk about democracy generally, it's at the level of nations, it's one nation, one vote. But that's not how these institutions function. These institutions maybe could have been plutocracies in the sense that you have $1, one vote. But that's not how this institution functions, because if you look at now, for example, the data we have, for example, China represents something like nearly 90% of global GDP in PPP terms. But you will see that China just represents 6% of voting and quota rights at the IMF. While, for example, Japan, Germany, France, and the UK, they only represent 10% of global GDP in PPP terms. But they represent twice in terms of voting and quota shares. So that means that this system is an aristocracy. That means that the power structure is just reflecting, past victories, and also rights that was conquered in the past, but they are no longer up to date. They are no longer, fit for the present. So from the creation of the UNCTAD, United Conference on Trade and Development, to the G77 New International Economic Order, there have been repeated proposals by the Global South to create a new and fairer world order. But most of these demands were made based on the assumption that the third world could thrive economically, provided that the needed reforms are made and accepted by the West. For example, if you look at the platform, of the new international economic order, they were asking for better prices for the raw materials exported by the third world, better market access to global north markets, technological transfers, and debt cancellation. And these are still the same demands made by the Global South to this global system. But at that time, the response from the North has been that we will not allow, these demands to be met. And the Global South, in fact, most of the countries, let's say in Latin America and Africa, was imposed structural adjustment policies by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, resulting in lost decades. The thinking about delinking by theoreticians like Samir Amin arose in that context. Samir Amin published his book, Delinking in French, in 1985. Next slide, please. And it was translated and published in English in 1990. So the delinking agenda starts from the assumption that economic catch-up is impossible for the third world. And by economic catch-up, it is not meant, technological modernization or upgrading. But the hypothesis that you could have an homogenization of consumption patterns, technological patterns, and also adopting the same patterns in terms of consumption of and waste of resources, there was no catch-up possible, because that is impossible under capitalism, because capitalism is a system that is inherently polarizing, as it is also a system that is intrinsically imperialist. So when you start from this assumption that capitalism is itself polarizing, and the legitimate demand from the third world would not be accepted by the global north. So that means that there is the need to have your own strategy to address this kind of global context. And that is what this delinking agenda is about. That means to push imperialism to adjust to national and popular priorities. So delinking is not synonymous with autarky. And Samir Amin identified five aspects. Next slide. And the first aspect was the control over the reproduction of the labor force. And when we say labor force, it's the agricultural, and the peasantry. So that, this peasantry could be afforded good prices for their products, and also they would be able, to increase production so that also this would maybe lower, the cost of the reproduction of the labor force. The second aspect was the control over the allocation of the economic surplus. That means having the control over your own financial system, building national financial institutions, and also having a strategy to direct investment where it is needed to meet the needs of the people. The third aspect is the control over national markets. That means that your industrialization and your economic development should be based on enlarging domestic markets, like Prof. C.P. Chandrasekhar, told about it yesterday. But at the same time, you have to arrive at the point where you do not necessarily need to have tariff protections in order to protect your market. So that means you need to simulate your own production and your own creativity. A fourth aspect is a control over natural resources. Having a national control over natural resources, but also over your export proceeds, because generally when you export natural resources, in some countries that are very commodity rich, you could accumulate many dollar assets, and it's not obvious that you could always control these dollar assets. We have seen that in the case of some countries like Libya, etc., their assets have been, stolen by the West to some extent. For example, when Libya was destroyed, and in the case of countries like Afghanistan, etc., we have seen also that their foreign reserves have been frozen. Another also, a fifth important aspect is the control over technology, because you could not rely on an economic development that is based on just trying to buy technologies coming from abroad. You have to develop your own technological basis, and that's really important, a critical component of delinking. So once you lay down this principle to implement a strategy of delinking, the question is which kind of countries could delink? Because in the past we saw that there have been many progressive governments who tried to do progressive policies for their people, but every time they would be, not every time, but often they would be overthrown. In the case of Africa in the early 60s, you have the governments of Lumumba, Modibo Keïta in Mali, Mamadou Dia in Senegal, Sylvanus Olympio in Mali, in Togo, and all of these governments have been to some extent removed from power by imperialism. So who can delink? There is a very interesting anecdote coming from Samir Amin, because he was invited in Burkina Faso by Thomas Sankara. And Thomas Sankara told him, Mr. Amin, you told us that we have to delink. And he said, before we had the courage to delink ourselves, the French delinked us. So what shall we do? And Samir Amin wrote retrospectively, I did not imagine that the delinking issue would be raised in a country as poor as Burkina Faso. So a strategy of individual delinking could be very difficult to sustain for countries that are not, that don't have the adequate size. So maybe delinking is a strategy that is less risky for, in the context of a new regionalism. Because when countries try to delink together through alliances, this will lower their economic costs, create greater political and military resilience, and probably will generate more lasting benefits, especially in the context of climate and environmental crisis. Nowadays, we might think of the BRICS as a platform for delinking. But the BRICS project is not without ambiguities. One thing is that the BRICS are clearly anti-Western hegemony. That's clear. At least some of them, some of the country members. But the members of the BRICS are not necessarily progressive themselves within their countries. And the thing is also, they do not necessarily have a project beyond capitalism. For now, all of their initiatives maintain us within the framework of capitalism. But despite these ambiguities, the existence of the BRICS as a group creates opportunities to forge beneficial alliances for most of the countries in the global south. China, for example, has been helping diversify economic partnerships of most of the global south and also increase their policy space, because China has been, for example, granting a lot of swap lines to many countries across the world, while the US have been just maintaining swap lines with 14 countries, mostly allied countries. While we talk about delinking, there's also one important issue, is that whether capitalism could allow the ecological transformation required at the global level. I can't delve into this question here, but my thinking is that capitalism could not deliver on climate and environmental goals. Furthermore, I also think that an international monetary system articulated around a selected currencies creates a debt crisis by necessity. And this type of international monetary financial system we have, according to me, could not allow us a smooth ecological transition. I also think that it is up to the global north to adjust first, because generally we say that, all countries should achieve net zero, these kind of things. I think it is up to the global north to adjust first. And it is also up to the global north to provide ecological reparations, because they create damage and they have to clean that damage. So they should provide reparations. But it is not likely. That's why I think the global south should organize and unite more to push the global north to adjust their mode of production, namely through a better control over their natural resources and land use. We have all these discussions about critical raw materials. Critical for whom? And most of these raw materials are in the global south. And I think the global south nations and people should assert greater control over their natural resources. So in conclusion, some leads in terms of areas where we need critically South-South solidarity. I think the first area where we need South-South solidarity, and that's really important, is the removal of military bases, foreign military bases, and the establishment of mutual defense pacts. Because if you had bad neighbors, you could not have your own autonomy, to pursue, progressive policies. So we are in a time of crisis, and there is a new transition, because the old hegemony is dying. And when the hegemony dies, generally you have a lot of militarism, a lot of violence. So it is more than ever necessary for peoples, to build, military alliances. And this have to be secured by the people themselves, because building military alliances could not be enough, because this could be tributary to electoral contingencies. That's why this have to be secured by the people themselves. And as one famous Western thinker used to say, Niccolo Machiavelli, there could not be no good laws without good weapons. So we have to have good weapons if we would like to assert our self-determination. The second area is that we need a kind of debtors club. People are talking about debtors cartel. But Thomas Sankara, the Burkinabe revolutionary leader, in his famous speech in 1987, talked about a united front against debt. We need that at this present crisis, where most of the countries in the global south are in debt crisis. We need also a commodity clubs in order to regulate the production of commodities globally. And so that means that there is need to have national controls over our commodities. In the 1965 Nkrumah wrote a book, Africa Must Unite. And at that time, he said Africa produces most of the cocoa in the world, so we have to unite the cocoa producing countries. And since then, he has not been followed. And these are things that are possible for a number of commodities produced in the global south. We need alternative payment systems. We need also R&D cooperation to facilitate technological modernization while lowering technological dependency. A last point, very important, is that also we need to promote multilingual platforms that will provide accurate information and analysis on the actual struggles of Global South countries away from Western-centric accounts. But the reality is that people in the Global South, countries in the Global South, do not know each other. And because generally they would just know what is happening, for example, in Asia through Western lenses, or what is happening in Africa through Western lenses. So there is a need to have platforms, multilingual platforms, where we would share together our experiences and also have a better understanding of our own context. So thanks for your attention.
I think now we'll move straight to Amali Vedagedara.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really, feel privileged to speak amidst two economists from Africa. I'm not sure about others from Sri Lanka, but I learned that when I started learning about what happened in Africa, I realized that Africa's past was Sri Lanka's present. So I'm going to share some of the kind of frustrations and dilemmas, maybe I can say we, as from Sri Lanka, are grappling with. And I'm also going to continue with the idea of delinking that Dongo was sharing, and how do we, as having elected a government which kind of departs from the mainstream political alliances that we had for the last decades since independence, and kind of rooting with that government, what kind of opportunities would a possible delinking process that can offer. I have prepared a speech because I'm not a very good storyteller, and for the sake of time and being, communicating something, and I think it'll be, facilitate that. So I'm going to talk about the economic crisis in Sri Lanka. Many of you know, because it was globalized, as it was our first default and the 17th involvement of the IMF program, and what the economic crisis was manifesting, the process of deindustrialization. And I'm going to put forward some proposals of financial reforms which would, facilitate the process of delinking. 60 years of engagement with the IMF and 75 years with the World Bank has structurally transformed Sri Lanka as a low-value, low-skilled and vulnerable peripheral economy in the global division of labor. Deindustrialization has been integral to reproducing Sri Lanka as a low-skilled, low-value destination. Eroding state-owned enterprises through rampant corruption, divestment and privatization has accompanied the promotion of vulnerable services such as tourism and low-value industries such as ready-made garments. The paper shortage Sri Lanka experienced in 2022 and the US tariff hike are rueful reminders of our precarious location as a country dependent on the global economy and subordinated to value extraction in the global value chains. Another aspect has been the financial subordination to international finance institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, and ADB, as well as private capital markets. It has been a vicious, interdependent cycle of low-value production and debt, constituting a debtor's prison. The debt restructuring deal, founded on a flawed debt sustainability analysis, has placed Sri Lanka on a dangerous trajectory with elevated risks of a second default towards 2028. Like in other underdeveloped countries where debt has been a net transfer of wealth to the creditor class. For example, the International Debt Report produced by the World Bank states that the private credit class pulled out around $185 billion more in principal repayments than they disbursed in loans. In Sri Lanka, as for the latest budget in 2025, we spent 60% of our national revenue to service debt. IMF arm twisting the government, which is ongoing, with the fourth tranche to bring about automatic market pricing in electricity, unbundle the electricity board into 3 different companies in generation, transmission, and distribution, so it would be easier to privatize profitable sectors. Also, agricultural modernization in terms of the promotion of agribusiness model, and transforming state-owned enterprises to run as private businesses, shifting away from the public purpose. The new government elected to bring about change shows signs of a peripheral state that accommodates and preserves the conditions of dependence than, our expectations. In this context, delinking, a theory that I think Dongo was explaining more clearly, which is introduced to us by Samir Amin. And delinking is a theory, it's an idea, and a set of policies that Samir Amin introduced to us. I think it can be helpful set of ideas for us. By delinking, Amin meant disrupting core periphery relations that impose international division of labor in peripheral countries as destinations of cheap labor, cheap raw material, and low-value production that perpetuate underdevelopment. Rather than blindly following these relations or deepening them as the World Bank and the IMF demand, Amin pointed out that delinking is vital as a precondition. I think Nimrod was kind of cautioning for using these words like preconditions, but I use it here. So I understood that delinking as a precondition to industrialize an economy. Delinking involves attaining self-sufficiency in food as a transition towards food sovereignty, creating employment, bringing about capital controls, local ownership of the financial market, nurturing a domestic market, and also sourcing productive technologies. As government has indicated in the 2025 budget, establishing a development bank is a vital step in owning local financial markets catering towards development. In Sri Lankan context, resolving chronic indebtedness among the working people, peasant women, farmers, fishers, factory workers, and small and medium entrepreneurs is also crucial to ensure that development bank can function properly. To illustrate, I think in the central bank, before it was discontinued under the new Independent Central Bank Act, was bringing this idea of gross value added. So in the central bank annual report, I'm quoting the 2022 report, they illustrate how the composition of the gross value added. And it is a helpful indicator to kind of understand why financial reforms are crucial to pave Sri Lanka towards a development trajectory. So according to this composition of gross value added, the smallholder economy, households and the non-profit sector contributing to the needs of the households dominate agriculture and services with 80.4% and 42.7% of gross value added. The non-financial sector, which is the manufacturing sector, dominates industries with 68.3% of gross value added. The financial sector only contributes marginally with a significant portion to services with 15.1% of gross value added. But if you look at the overall Sri Lankan economy, you will see how the composition of top businesses have transformed over last 40 years. We see among the top 40, like the rank, you see the finance, insurance, and real estate companies. Basically, the fire sector dominating over the other productive sectors of the economy in industries and agriculture. So you see that the smallholder economy and the manufacturing sector are suppressed by the financial sector. Agriculture, artisan industries, and other small and medium industries, which constitute the productive economy in terms of food production, manufacturing essential goods, job creation, have been decimated due to extractive lending carried out by finance companies. The bloated financial sector thrives at the cost of productive sectors. Financial reforms, in parallel to debt relief, there are people like the microfinance affected women for the last 5 years and the small and medium enterprises who've been demanding for debt relief, basically debt cancellation and alternative forms of credit, is a must to correct this imbalance. Ensure that extractive lending and speculative activities do not undermine developmental initiatives oriented towards delinking. It is interestingly becoming clear that to gain monetary and fiscal autonomy and achieve all this, Sri Lanka has to exit from the IMF program, reverse the independence of the Central Bank Act, and abolish the Economic Transformation Act, which serves the interest of capital and preserves Sri Lanka's location as a peripheral state. Thank you.
Okay, so now it's time for questions and comments from the audience. Maybe we'll take a number of questions and comments, and then we'll have the panel respond. If you can keep your comments brief so that everybody else can get a chance to speak. And maybe I'll start with one question, and then we'll to actually all three panelists. I think the whole question of finance. Yesterday, Bruno mentioned the international division of finance. Now, in the context of delinking, what are the possibilities for development, growth? Because delinking also would mean in some way delinking from global finance as we've known it. Or what are the possibilities for industrialization or building more productive growth? Okay, so we'll take some more questions. Maybe we'll start with maybe Bruno, you want to start?
Okay. Thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. And my question is in principle to Ndongo, but obviously if the others want to comment as well, regarding the role of Europe in the possibility of moving into a new international order. But because what we see now is that the Europeans are completely lost with the geopolitical situation. They feel like if they had lost their mother and father because of Trump, then they realize that they cannot rely on the US. And it's interesting to see that finally there is a movement. I was invited in Berlin by a conservative think tank, and finally they asked me, how would you feel, being a Brazilian, in having Europe connected to the global south? So they feel themselves like somehow squeezed in the geopolitical dispute between US and China, and they themselves now they want to be non-allied. they want to be together with the global south, and I'm obviously skeptical about it, and that was my answer to this question, because, well, there is the whole history of colonization, which for them is still not solved. But I would like to, at the same time, obviously, it would be nice to have them specifically for some purposes of the transformations we need. So I want to listen from you about this move, the geopolitical move that Europe is making now.
Okay, good morning to everyone, and thank you to all the presenters. My name is Freedom from Zimbabwe. To Ndongo, and possibly Nimrod, we clearly understand when you say that BRICS presents a potential as part of your recommendations. We understand. But one of the critiques that has been provided on BRICS is that it is not a political project, and that we need a political project almost similar to the Bandung conference, and later on the non-aligned movement, to push delinking and the other stuff. So my question is that, do you still think that BRICS, we move with BRICS, or we start afresh and come up with a project that is political? Because if you look at BRICS currently, you find China, it has its own ideologies. You find that South Africa, it has its own, Brazil, its own. So there's no that kind of uniformity or coherence. So I think, yeah, so I'll leave it at that so that you can respond.
I would like to understand, in order to have a better new economic order, what is the role of nation state?
I have a small comment. This is actually one of the problem with Samir Amin's paradigms, is that the same precondition to be able to control or master the process of accumulation, the same five, are also the same five that characterize the core countries, which he called the monopolies. So basically the question here, which is the debate among Amin and Arrighi, is what if you have the capacity to go beyond the asymmetry? Because his own system is to say that we will still be peripheral countries as long as we are not able to delink. So the only exception so far is China. So then the question is China now a core country? Then it becomes an imperialist country. And this is, I think, one of the very tricky issue. And the second link, and this is basically to reflect, no, I don't have clear answer, but it is clear that small country can't delink, but with autonomy or collective autonomy, it is highly possible. But the example of all the countries who have delinked, they didn't do it with collective autonomy. Whether it's the United States, Germany, Swiss, or China, they all have delinked in a way. So there are small contradictions on the issue of that process. And I think even in his writing, this mirror effect between core and periphery and what makes you an asymmetric impossibility to go beyond has not been solved totally. And this is the debate on whether, for example, exists semi-periphery. And this is the question of Arrighi, that there are semi-periphery, and probably you have seen our writings on Wallerstein, Gunther Frank, and Amin on this fight. So basically, is a semi-periphery a transitional stage? Does it exist or not? China, is it a semi-periphery? country, or, as Amin is saying, all those countries are still periphery. It's just that they are, those so-called emerging countries are in fact just the periphery of the future, but they are the margin of the periphery. So you have ce qu'il appelle quart monde, which is like the four worlds, Burkina Faso or Senegal or Nepal, and then you have those who are advanced, which is China and India and so on.
We'll ask the panel to respond. So there's a question on delinking and finance, a question on realignment of Germany, Europe, and so on, given the sort of current unraveling. A question about BRICS, the role of the nation state, and then a more theoretical question about Samir Amin and China, and whether it's a core country, how we understand the semi-periphery, and what are the ways forward. So a lot of big questions. We'll start with Dongo and then Amali and then Nimrod.
Okay. We received tough questions, so I'm not sure that we could give, convincing answers. The first question I learned about the possibilities for development growth and the current, international monetary financial system. I mean, it is always possible in the sense that the linking agenda is about taking, the world as it is and try to change that from within first. This international monetary finance system is hierarchical, is asymmetric, and we could have seen that in the presentation yesterday by Bruno. My own thinking is that this system creates debt crisis by necessity, because the one particular feature of that system is that some selected currencies are used as reserve assets, means of payments for the global economy. And there have been many discussions after the creation of the Bretton Woods system, and saying that this system simply could not work and will collapse. And it collapsed because at one point it was based, the dollar was attached to gold. And it could have collapsed earlier, but it did not, because the US managed to say to some countries like Germany, you will not cash in, your dollar surpluses into gold, for example. And this, extended the life expectancy of this gold exchange standard. But even if we no longer had this, anchoring to gold, we have similar problems to some extent. So I think we should get rid of this system. And I think you could not get rid of this system by being within the Bretton Woods institutions. And I think partly the BRICS project is a way of creating, alternative payment system, alternative financial structures that would help us delink and make obsolete the international financial system based on Bretton Woods system, Bretton Woods institutions. So this could be possible. But at the same time, there are limitations to what could be achieved economically in terms of economic development within a capitalist framework. So countries that are, having good policies, industrial policies, etc., could achieve some progress. But collectively speaking, there are really, limitations to what could be achieved under capitalism, because capitalism historically has been based on appropriating resources from the peripheries, but also their biocapacities to some extent. And generalizing, the modes of consumption and waste of resources from the core could not be possible. So that's why you need a post-capitalist, anti-capitalist model. That was I would say. About Europe, Europe is in disarray because Trump, to some extent, betrayed them. But we don't know what could happen, because Trump is a very volatile, has a very volatile character to some extent. And maybe after Trump, you'll have, a new democratic administration. We can know. But for me, what seems clear is that the 21st century world will be an Afro-Asian world. And I base that on demographic trends. If you look at, the demographic projections of the UN, the Median scenario, by the end of this century, around 90% of the world population will be located between Asia and Africa. So it will create, a new balance of forces. So for now, the question for me, for Africa is whether we would like to be, scattered between, competing blocks, or whether we would like to be our own center. I think that's the main problem for us now. But when you look at demographic trends, it's sure that, we'll have new equilibrium. And this also creates, opportunities to have, new forms of regionalism and economic development based on enlarging, domestic regional markets. But I do not think that Europe could be a reliable partner, generally speaking, because this is due to their legacy of colonialism, imperialism, which is still ongoing. About the BRICS, I think, it's contradictory. It's contradictory, but at the same time, it opens possibilities. For example, in the Sahel, the chaos created in the Sahel was by, Western imperialism to some extent. And they did not have, any ways to solve that to some extent. And these countries, in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, they tried to at least, change what is happening there. And this would not have been possible without the help of Russia. So they managed to remove French military bases, US military bases. And this would not have been possible if we didn't have this context of multipolarity. So despite the fact that you have, BRICS members that are not that progressive, domestically speaking, but at least their existence creates, opportunities for other countries to have some space for progressive policies and, also have some space, towards, imperialist dictates. And as I was saying, China is the critical country among the BRICS because it's technologically sophisticated, and it has been also trying to create new arrangements that could be beneficial to, to most of the global south. There have been debates whether China is imperialist or not. There has been this sub-imperialism category. But I would say that, the imperialist remains, core countries, Western Europe, Japan, the UK, etc. About the category of semi-periphery, for me it's an interesting category. And I think yesterday when I was looking at Bruno's presentation, I was thinking that maybe what was lacking was just this category of semi-periphery. Because a country like China, for example, to some extent you could say it's peripheral, but to some extent also it's kind of core country because it's technologically sophisticated, but it also have, characteristics of most of the global south in sense of low labor, low wage, and also, the predominance of, the informality to some extent. You have that also in China. So you have these features that makes that you could not say that China is a core country or China is peripheral. It has, both aspects. That's why I think that maybe this category of semi-periphery could be interesting.
I would like to address the question of the nation state. Last week we had an event here as a pre-event to the 70 years of Bandung conference. And there I think we kind of, I was thinking how frustrating and disappointing it is to grapple with the nation state when we try to, mobilize forces towards a new world order. And I think nation state as in general has been disappointing for people, especially if, of people of minoritized communities. I mean, Sri Lanka is a very good example. But I think when you think about nation state as an entity, we can also see that it is not a constant entity, it is in formation. So it is not so hopeless if you think about the possibilities of people mobilizing collectively towards on these ideas of alternatives and change. And I think, as Dongo was saying, that if you take as a demographic unit, Africa and Asia is going to be the majority. And our lived experiences are not really reflected in the current global order. We are the outsiders. So if the people are ready to mobilize towards, I mean, to pressurize the nation state, to construct the nation states, to represent our ideas, our interests, I think that new world order is, I think there's no kind of contradiction. The nation states will not be an obstacle. Thanks.
Thanks. I mean, maybe let me come in first on the question of delinking, which I have to admit I'm being schooled in. I suppose one set of questions I would have is how this notion of delinking, I suppose, relates to the framework that I suppose I'm more familiar with and associated with, which is perhaps more of a structuralist kind of approach. So, I mean, some thoughts and questions that occurred to me in this discussion. The one is the great development economist Alice Amsden, who wrote the definitive account of South Korea's development, had placed a lot of emphasis on this notion of emulation. So how do developing countries, rather than kind of taking a very abstract set of ideas that are arrived at from deductive reasoning, take a more inductive approach and say, what have other countries done, and how might we be able to emulate that with necessary adaptations? And of course the argument is that what South Korea did is they emulated what their former colonial power Japan did, and took important lessons from Japan about their own economic development path, which as we know was around building these enormous conglomerates, economies of scale and scope, and so forth. So the question I would have is, if one takes the framework of emulation, which countries might one be able to draw lessons from if one wanted to go down the route of delinking? And it's like Aziz read my mind, because I was immediately thinking, how do you locate China in this framework? Are they delinked? Clearly they're not. Then some comments which have come up about technology development and acquisition of technology. Again, the argument that Amsden made was that, at least in the initial stages, the way developing countries acquire technology is they import it, they adapt it, sometimes improve on it, followed by a stage which China is very clearly in, of their own research and development and developing their own technologies. And in some cases China is well ahead of the US and the EU in terms of certain technologies. But in order to do that, in order to acquire, adopt, adapt technology, countries need to be able to manage the balance of payments constraint, because it essentially involves importing capital equipment and other embodied technology in the form of capital equipment. That means that they've got to pay attention to exports in order to be able to pay for the import of that technology. It's quite a different approach to trade than the kind of standard free trade, neoliberal approach to trade, which is, isn't about that strategic building up of industrial capabilities and the ability to initially replace imports, but also to export in turn. So, yeah, I mean, in a way, I'm kind of bouncing it back almost and saying, how does that kind of framework relate to the delinking kind of framework? I don't have a lot to say on the BRICS and other kind of groups, international groupings like the G77 and even the G20, which a number of developing countries are part of, except to say that I think developing countries are very overstretched in engaging in all of these different fora, in the BRICS, in the G20, the G77, and I wonder how much of that engagement is, almost a bit mechanical, rather than really strategic and aimed at building, forging common South-South positions. I think it sometimes has emerged over single issues, like the COVID-19 patent waiver, for instance. But in general, it's almost like it's a bit performative, perhaps, and a major weakness of developing countries' engagements in these international fora.
Okay, we have to wrap up soon, but any final questions? So 2 hands over here. Maybe we'll just limit it to those 2, and then I want to give the panelists a last chance to respond. Huh? Okay.
So my question was about class power. So how we make a strategy of building class power absolutely core to this analysis of delinking. So firstly, how is building class power essential to control of industry and resources, and not just in a really abstract way, but how do we ensure that in our analysis and strategy we have an extremely serious and detailed breakdown of where are we organized, in which sectors, how, what's the state of our movements. Then secondly, how do we deal with what the tensions are actually between building class power sometimes and a kind of interstate project, and how do we ensure that we stay mobilized? And the third element being how building class power can be a means to also have a political horizon that's beyond just, increasing our relative sovereignty into transforming our societies for justice.
My questions also, I have 2 questions, specifically on delinking for all the panelists. The first one is about delinking and alternative regionalism, the idea that you proposed, Ndongo. Because we know that delinking is about creating an inward-looking economy, or what Samir Amin called development auto-centré, an auto-centered development, creating more value inside the economy, moving the value chain, industrializing. And this has proved very difficult in the most countries, maybe except for China. So what kind of regional blocks that you can imagine that these things can happen in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America? And the other question is what the chair has asked around finance. how do we mobilize finance for that kind of projects of industrialization and delinking?
Okay, so I think Amali has a question, but also if you have any final, after your question, if you have any final thoughts, and then we're going to do, and then maybe Nimrod, if you have any final comments, then we'll come to Dongo.
I think my question can kind of take a cue from Hamza, because I think we are not talking about this loud I in BRICS India, because since we are in Sri Lanka, and I think we spoke about possible debtors club, say like solidarity alliances, how do we kind of understand India? Because India, of course, is a kind of a global south country, maybe figuring in the semi-periphery, but with alliances with the United States and in all the Quad and all. And I think with recent post-default interventions, Indian interventions in Sri Lanka, and maybe in South Asia in general, I would love if we can bring in India also into this conversation. I don't have any last remarks.
Thanks. I think, let me talk to the issue of alternate regionalism. In the African context, a lot of hope is being placed on the African Continental Free Trade Area. I would say that the jury is still out on the effectiveness and the prospects of the AFCFTA. What is encouraging for me is that there is an approach that says that, this is not about dropping barriers to trade and then automatically expecting that African countries are going to trade more with each other, because the underlying weakness is the productive structure. To make a very crude example, Zambia produces copper, DRC produces copper. DRC and Zambia are not going to trade copper with each other. I think that building that industrial base for a larger regional market is one element. But I would also caution against an approach that says, well, in the process we will ignore the broader international market, because there really are value-added opportunities that African countries have, and they should not, discard them. So I think it's kind of a pragmatic approach. What does domestic demand look like? What are the sources of export demand within the region, outside the region, without being too dogmatic about how that ought to configure itself. The finance part is incredibly important, mobilizing finance, regional and domestic sources of finance. One of my own areas of interest is on the role of African development banks. And I think there is a bit of an underestimation of the scope to mobilize resources on the continent through various mechanisms. One is cracking down on illicit flows. Another is capturing resource rents and diverting them into development banks to invest in more diversified economies. There are fiscal instruments that can come to play. I think slowly and cautiously there might be instruments that central banks can mobilize, which I think will partly depend on the way in which central banks, what central banks are doing in other regions. So Yeah, so I think that I would those two are correctly very appropriately linked together: the alternative regionalism and mobilization of finance.
Maybe I'll just add a small comment and give Dongo the last word. But I think Amali's question about India, and I think what we need to recognize is also the asymmetry of power within the global south, right? And I think Amali's also maybe thinking about the same question of Adani's inroads into Sri Lanka, for example, and the kind of role of almost like a monopoly capital in the region. So how do we think of these asymmetries of both political and economic power? And when we're thinking of delinking, do we have to also think of a coalition of smaller states? I think Dongo talked about the coalition of debtor states, but we need to think of configurations that are not just regional or geographical. But anyway, Dongo.
Thanks, Ahilan. Before answering the questions by Hamza, I would like to come back on the issue of emulation. I think it's important, especially in discussion of the developmental state. But I think the macro conditions at the global level are really important if you are to understand development possibilities. In the case of South Korea, I mean, these countries studied by Ali Sampson, Hajung Chang, etc., they had good policies, but they had also very favorable external conditions. For example, if you look at South Korea, they had a merchandise deficit for at least 3 decades, 1955 to the early 1980s. But they had a surplus in services. Why? Because they were receiving U.S. money for U.S. military bases. So these countries developed under conditions where they have limited balance of payment constraints to most of the global south. So, I mean, they did good things, but they also benefited from conditions that, imperialism did not allow, to most of the global south. And if you take also the case of China, China also industrialized in a context where you had trade liberalization. So if China started, to open and to go to world markets in a context where you had Donald Trumps everywhere, I mean, the Chinese development experience would have been very different. So the external conditions are really very important when we would like to see what kind of, emulation or not is possible. And I'm thinking also of a very interesting, reflection by Deng Xiaoping, because he used to say to the West, well, you say that we should all be democratic, etc. Fine. He said, we in China at that time, we are 1.2 billion people. And in any society, you have at least 1%, rebellious people, dissident. He said 1% here is 12 million. So what is the prospect of having, Tiananmen demonstrations, every day in China? How will you manage that? We are not Norway. So that means that sometimes, there are things that could not be, reproduced, in different contexts. I'm not saying that, you have to have some particular political, institutions, but there are limits to what could be reproduced elsewhere. And the thing is that in the history of capitalism has been progressive to some extent economically when its existence was threatened by the existence of an alternative economic model. I mean, the socialist model or, the struggles of the anti-colonial movements. So about class power, it's really a difficult question because historically also what we have seen is that the late experience of economic development, generally we see that the size of the states, the control over the economy by the states has tended to become greater. So if you want to somehow catch up a bit, generally the tendency has been to have big states and also big financial institutions, you see. And when you have big states, generally it's not too democratic. So I think that there is a need to have a kind of a balance to some extent. And generally, democratization is something good. For example, yesterday, Professor Chandas had
talked about asset inequality. This is really important. You see, for example, in the African countries, I mean, that are ranked as the most democratic, for example, Botswana, South Africa, Namibia, when you look at the wealth inequality, it's among the highest worldwide. Why? Because you have land inequality. So you could see that countries that are labeled as kleptocracies, like Angola or Equatorial Guinea, they have, less wealth inequality than those so-called democratic countries in Southern Africa. So you need democratization to some extent, and by addressing asset inequality. But at the same time, you need a strong state, unfortunately, if you want to somehow regulate peripheral capitalisms. About finance, quickly. For me, the most important constraint is not finance, but it's technology. Because ultimately, what creates financial dependency is that you have material and technical dependence over other countries. And if you have those technologies, you could, somehow have some form of autonomy. Because for me, finance has always to start national. There are many things you could do at home. There are issues that are global for which you need global financial instruments. Yesterday, I was talking to two people from the central bank, and we were talking about their balance of payment issues, and I was asking them whether they had some, room for maneuver to lower some imports, etc. They said, yes, that is possible in agriculture, and also we could also increase our agricultural exports. And I say, well, what is lacking then? He said, oh, the technology. And I said, could you produce the technology? He said, yes, we could. So, I said, normally you should have no financing constraint because you have the productive capacity to do it. But he says the IMF would not allow us to do that. So you could see that in that case, it's not necessarily financial constraints that are more binding, but political constraints to some extent. You see. So if you change your, domestic arrangement and have a kind of different economic model, maybe there are other economic possibilities you would have that would lower your balance of payments constraints.
Okay, thank you very much, Dongo, Amali, and Nimrod. I think we had a really good discussion. So now we'll break for tea, and hopefully we can come back in about 20 minutes. Thank you to the audience also for your questions, and please try to come back in 20 minutes.
what I intend looking at very briefly today is to look at the implications of the coming of what seems to be a dramatic change in the global geopolitical economy. It's really going to be only 2 months since the second stint of Donald Trump as President of the United States, and there have been a dramatic set of both announcements and policies which have been implemented. And in the economic sphere, on the sphere of political economy generally, there have been about 3 or 4 areas in which the moves have been quite stark and significant. The first, of course, is that Trump started by beginning to implement what he said was going to be the imposition of significant tariffs on imports into the United States in order to be able to bring factories back or production back to the US from the rest of the world where it had been offshored over a period of time. He threatened to put these tariffs on some of his closest allies, on Mexico, on Canada, on Europe, and of course he was going to put tariffs on China. And to top it all, he said that he's going to have a set of reciprocal tariffs, that is, he would impose, besides these additional tariffs, equivalent tariffs to any taxes which are levied on American imports into other countries, an equivalent reciprocal tax. Of course, at the moment, we know that the tariffs on Canada and Mexico are on hold till April. The 10% additional tax on top of what was imposed on China is in place across a range of commodities. There is talk that there's going to be implementation of the reciprocal tax in April, and basically the whole idea is that it's a combination of trying to assure the white working class, which voted for Trump to bring him back to power from what seemed to be almost criminal wilderness, given the cases which had been launched against him. So it is to appease the white working class in part, but it also is being weaponized as an instrument to achieve both economic and strategic goals, in particular in favor of American capital. The second tendency which we are observing is an extremely aggressive effort to demand trade and investment concessions on the part of competing countries, or countries in which which are the trade and economic partners of the United States, including the countries in Europe. And this has gone to the extent of actually Trump demanding that he get access to territory or to facilities which vary from the Panama Canal to land which is the Gaza Strip, which he wants to convert into the Riviera, to Greenland, which he wants to take over, and he said that he's going to actually send the military in. But basically taking an extremely aggressive stance in terms of saying that I want access to facilities and territory, which is going to improve the status on the position of US capitalism as a global hegemon. The third aspect which we observe is that along with this tendency to demand these kinds of or making these kinds of statements with regard to territorial ambitions, we seem to have a tendency on his part to identify areas in which there are crucial critical minerals which are important from the point of view of the new stage we are in terms of industrial transformation. That is, we basically are looking at areas which have critical minerals which go into, let's say, the new energy sectors and so on. So he wants that in Ukraine. He wants that. He wants a deal with Ukraine in which, in return for ending the war in Ukraine and giving some degree of security, which is of course going to be financed by the Europeans and not by the US anymore, he actually wants to take the critical minerals as a payoff for his role in Ukraine. He wants to do the same thing in Greenland, where cryptolite and such other critical minerals are available. And he's trying to do that wherever he thinks that it's possible for him to get access to these minerals on terms which he sees have to be special, given the role of the United States as markets for these countries globally. And finally, what we have is that he wants to, in some sense, while he has this aggressive tendency with regard to trade and investment, etc., he's taking a position that he wants to withdraw.
who is the Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being very economical with your tea break. This panel will discuss decolonization, Bandung spirit, and the new international economic order. 7 decades ago, in 1955, the heads of 29 African and Asian countries, as well as representatives from colonies that had not yet won their independence, met in Bandung, Indonesia, for the Afro-Asian Conference. It was one of the high points in the process of decolonization. As we have been discussing yesterday and in the course of this week, this was a historical gathering because it was the first time that representatives of hundreds of millions of people from the Third World came together to discuss the enormous social process known as decolonization and assess its implications. Sukarno, who headed the government of Indonesia and hosted the conference, opened it with a speech that suggested that the ambitions of the people who organized it. He said he wanted the conference to give guidance to humankind, and that this guidance would point out to mankind the way which it must take to attain safety and peace. The leaders gathered not only to celebrate the independence of India, the Chinese Revolution, devolution of power in the Gold Coast that led to a free Ghana. They wanted to give evidence that a new Asia and a new Africa was born. Sukarno's associate, Rosalind Abdul Ghani, was the Secretary General of the Bandung Conference, and during the conference and after the conference, he began to speak about a Bandung spirit, which he described as a spirit of love for peace, anti-violence, anti-discrimination, and development for all, without trying to intervene for one another wrongly, but to pay a great respect to one another. This Bandung spirit was not just idealism. It had a material base rooted in the freedom struggles of people in the colonized world, which the United Nations General Assembly described 5 years later in the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and People, as a process of liberation that is irresistible and irreversible. This spirit was born in mass struggles against colonialism and was then brought together by anti-colonial activists as they met in an international arena, especially in Europe and the very citadels of colonialism. All the leaders spoke with the same reverberating voice, that this is the spirit and voice of their people who were colonized, oppressed, and humiliated. The Bandung spirit was the voice of hundreds of millions who had lived under colonial rule and who spoke out against the horrendousness of colonialism, as well as their hope for a new world order. However, as you know, the strength of neocolonial structures that continued despite the end of the formal colonial rule was such that the Bandung spirit soon dissipated. Only nostalgia for it remained. Generations born after the colonial rule could no longer hold close to them the residue of the long and difficult colonial struggles. The national liberation agenda corroded with those neocolonial structures. The peasants and workers of the post-colonial era saw their own ruling classes as the problems and did not see the inherited problems of that intractable structure as their enemy. However, the recent and frequent economic crises confronting Asia, Africa, and Latin America, people are looking more sharply at the structures that keep them down. The Bretton Woods institutions are more sharply in focus, as is a mercurial president in the White House. The IMF guidance on structural adjustment, with orders to entice foreign investment at any cost and trade liberalization, rings hollow in this context. So 70 years after the Bandung Conference, it's worth asking if the Bandung spirit remains intact or whether it can be resurrected in the global south, and can it challenge the global north. In the course of the last week, as we rekindled the discussions around Bandung and the non-aligned movement that it spawned, and the solidarity that was created between the newly liberated countries in Asia and Africa, we reconfirmed that revisiting Bandung and the spirit of Bandung should not be a nostalgic walk down memory lane or an invitation to recalibrate those lessons and experiences at the margins. Rather, it should be seen as providing the space and the opportunity for critical reflection and a process that gives us strength in these present challenging times. That is the objective of this meeting and this panel in particular. We hope it will provoke fresh thinking on the possibilities in this tumultuous era and generate discussion and debate. When the new economic order was discussed, the key themes of the new economic order included both sovereign equality and the right to self-determination, especially when it comes to sovereignty over natural resources. Another key theme was the need for a new commodity order through international commodity agreements and a common fund for commodity price stabilization. Restructuring international trade was also central as a means of improving developing countries' terms of trade, such as by diversifying developing economies through industrialization, integrating developing economies into the regional free trade blocs, and reducing developing country tariffs, another obstacle to free trade, and expanding generalized trade preferences and designing other agreements to reduce trade barriers. All these were discussed. These proposals to restructure the international economic order also sought to reform the Bretton Woods system, which had benefited the leading states that had created it, especially the United States. Today, even this has been upended. Today, we have 4 interesting panelists who will look at the tatters of the new economic order of the 1970s and look at what is or what should be done next. Our speakers are Dr. Sabato Nyamsenda from Tanzania, Mr. Balasinga Skantakumar from Sri Lanka, Dr. Javiera Maria Manzi Araneda from Chile, and Dr. Farabi Faki from Indonesia, who unfortunately could not attend due to ill health, but he has sent a video. I will introduce all the speakers first and then give them strict instructions about timekeeping, but I think it's going to be very fascinating. Dr. Sabato Nyamsenda from Tanzania is a social activist and assistant lecturer in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration at the University of Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. He echoes the thoughts of Nkrumah and Nyerere when he calls for reimagining South-South solidarity with NAM G77, and he's called upon them to act like a trade union of the poor in negotiating with the rest of the world. This is going to be a tough call in countries where trade unions are being smashed, but I'm sure he'll have interesting ideas to share. We recall Nkrumah, who recognized he was so radical that he couldn't stay in office for too long. Nkrumah recognized that reforms did not transform the fundamental nature of capitalism, although workers did achieve some gains. The gains which workers secured in a capital countries, though real, did not bring about structural change, and Nkrumah called for unity as the first requisite in destroying neocolonialism. Nyerere, as a spokesman for NAM, was preoccupied with uprooting Portuguese colonialism and white minority regimes in southern Africa in the 1970s. He played a major role in extending the ambit of NAM from its initial focus on political equality to include economic justice. By taking on the issues of achieving resource sovereignty at home as well as reforming the international trade and monetary system, he really proposed a radical agenda. Mr. Balasingham Skantakumar is with the Social Scientists Association of Sri Lanka, and he's the author of Labour's Lost Agency in Labour and its Discontents, Pathways of the Left in Sri Lanka. And he also co-authored Growth with Inequality, Neoliberal Authoritarianism in Sri Lanka, and contributed to the LST Review. Dr. Javiera Maria Manzi Aranada from Chile is a sociologist, archivist, an independent curator, as well as an active member and former spokesman of Coordinado Feminista 8M from Chile. I'm sure she'll explain the title of this organization more fully. Her research focuses on the intersections between visual culture, the feminist movement, and social struggles. She's the co-author of Graphic Resistance, Dictatorship in Chile, and editor of The Feminist General Strike is On, Histories of an Ongoing Process. She has curated exhibitions for museums and cultural institutions in Santiago, Havana, Valencia, Mexico City, Madrid, and Buenos Aires. As an archivist, she has been committed to the recovery and dissemination of archives from feminist organizations and resistance movements during Chile's civil-military dictatorship. She's currently the general editor of Modernismo Latinoamericano.org. It is a digital platform dedicated to reconstructing the trajectories of social thought and the visual and material culture of emancipated projects. Her perspectives were inspired by Olga Pobleto, who spoke at the Bandung conference, and I will leave it to her to speak more fully. Before I introduce the second speaker in absentia, I think a special round of applause. She has been like Marco Polo, spending 72 hours on planes and in airports trying to get here from Chile to Sri Lanka. And we don't have, apart from Pablo Neruda, who did come to Sri Lanka, probably a swifter journey many decades ago. She's, I think, and Che Guevara, who did come to Sri Lanka and reside in the Golf Ace Hotel. I think you have made a monumental journey, and she deserves a special round of applause for this. Dr. Farabi Faki from Indonesia is a lecturer at the Department of History, University of Gadjah Mada in Yogyakarta, Indonesia, and is the author of the book Authoritarian Modernization in Indonesia's Early Independence Period, 1950 to 1965. We are very sorry that he couldn't be here, and he can't field questions, but the video will be very important, and I hope we will keep this spirit of engagement and solidarity going in the next days, months to come. Thank you, and I'll call on the speakers, 10 minutes each, please, and then we'll open it to Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. So, in this presentation, basically, Okay, so I'm going to highlight the contribution of Africa, and particularly the two giant African thinkers and leaders, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the independence leader of Ghana, and Julius Nyerere, who was the independence leader of Tanzania, both of whom played a crucial role in building South-South solidarity and taking the Bandung spirit forward. So let me start with Nkrumah. He wrote a book which has been introduced here before, Neocolonialism, the Last Stage of Imperialism, which was actually the restating of Lenin's imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism in the post-colonial era. He's trying to explain why, even after countries gained independence, imperialism had not collapsed because it had metamorphosed into neocolonialism. And towards the end of the book, of course, he called for radical delinking from the imperialist world order through unity. And unity at two levels. The first level was at the continental level. He was a strong advocate of the United States of Africa continentally, but the second level was at the tricontinental level when he was calling for third world solidarity under the spirit of Bandung. Those are his own words. And of course, his critique was very radical, and his call for unity, and especially at home, was radical. So a few months after the publication of this book, Nkrumah was overthrown in a coup that was orchestrated by the CIA. Now, after Nkrumah's overthrow, it is Nyerere who picked up the baton, because prior to that, in the 60s, he was very busy, preoccupied with the struggles to uproot Portuguese colonialism as well as white minority regime in Southern Africa. But after Nkrumah's overthrow, he picked up the baton. He became Africa's leading voice in the non-alignment movement. And he played a very crucial role in the transformation of the non-aligned movement from a movement that was principally preoccupied with political equality to include economic justice. Actually, he was calling for NAM to function as a trade union of the poor, because for him, he likened poor countries, third world countries, to the proletarian classes in capitalist countries. So they should unite in the same way as workers united under trade unions to fight for their rights. And he had hopes that imperialism can reform itself when poor countries have a bargaining power under the non-aligned movement. So he was a strong Africa's leading voice in the struggle for the new international economic order, which, among other things, was fighting for the reforming of the international monetary and trade system. And you can, like, this whole book of his is dedicated to that struggle. And his hope was that imperialism would be able to make concessions, the same concessions that it made at home to the capitalists, to the working class through welfare policies and living wages. It can also do that internationally to poor countries that we are fighting for economic justice under the new international economic order. Now, Nyerere, unlike Nkrumah, who died 5 years after his overthrow, Nyerere lived long enough to see imperialism and neocolonialism actually metamorphosing into neoliberalism, the most bankrupt stage of capitalism. Now, in the 80s, and because he believed in negotiation and dialogue, there was this summit that was planned, and he had the support, of course, of Nordic countries, which bought into his agenda of reforming the international economic system. But at the Cancun summit of 1981, where now in the UK there was the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher, and the US was under Republican Party under Ronald Reagan, and it was a neoliberal era. The World Bank, IMF had been transformed into missionary institutions for spreading the free market gospel and all that. So at that summit, as you can see, the UK and the US categorically rejected the idea of the new international economic order, and that's when it was buried. So these are the two leaders that were present. Michael Manley, who was Nyerere's leading comrade, who was at the summit, and he says, Reagan killed it with a smile. And then, of course, Nyerere reflected years later that it was very depressing, because when Reagan said no, even the other leaders from social democratic governments in the North also said that is the end. And from that time, there was a lot of conspiracy against Tanzania. Actually, after the overthrow of Allende in 1973, Tanzania became the second target of neoliberal machinations. So the IMF and World Bank strangled the economy in the country, while Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher were also burying his reform agenda at the international level. So what can we learn? But of course now, let me go back to this. So here we have two models. So Michael Manley, after that, he transformed. I think those who are coming from Jamaica know. He became a complete neoliberal. When he came back into power, he said, I cannot fight these, and therefore I'm going to join them. But then Nyerere did not change. Actually, it dawned on him that imperialism cannot be reformed. If the North is not ready to make concessions, then it's the duty of the South to reorganize itself. So in 1986, he was nominated by Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, and then he was approved by the Non-Aligned Movement to head the South Commission, which issued its report in 1990, titled The Challenge to the South. So in this report, the language had changed from the North reforming itself to the South relying on itself. So he was basically calling for the collective self-reliance of southern countries. And as you later see, and this is my last but one slide, is that Nyerere is credited as being the architect of the idea of BRICS. This is actually the argument that is made by Vijay Prashad in his book, The Poor Nations. So you can see the transformation. Pre-Cancun, he believed in bargaining with the North, hoping that it can make concessions. But after Cancun, he said the North is not ready, so the South should go alone. So they should work together to achieve collective self-reliance. But again, his struggles, for him, the urgency of change was the state. So he believed in the nation state, and his activism was based on mobilizing fellow heads of states. Whereas for Nkrumah, his idea was about radical delinking and he uses these words, through the destroying imperialism at home. And he believed that if southern countries can delink from imperialism, then it will automatically collapse at home, because it will not have the surpluses to maintain its welfare systems at home, which will make the working classes at home rebel against the system, and automatically we will have a socialist system. But again, for him, even though he called on states to unite, both at tricontinental level and at continental level, but he said this unity of states must be subordinated to the unity of the masses. So he believed his conception had a notion of classes. So you have to have these anti-imperialist, pro-liberation masses of our continents as the basis of the unity among states. Now, we have two models. I'm not the expert of this, but I'm trying to, later in the conversation, to make Samba from Senegal, but also my friends from Chile and Brazil talk about this. About ALBA, we have not talked about the alliance of Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of America, which to me it's an old experiment, but it points actually to what Nkrumah was advocating. I know there is a lot of sanctions that are being placed on ALBA and Venezuela to the extent that it cannot breathe. But also there is this is a new experiment, the Alliance of Sahel States in Africa, bringing 3 states of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger So it will be good to study these experiences as some of the experiments that are treading the path that Nkrumah advocated. But again, we have the BRICS. Some scholars have been very critical of it in the sense that much as, of course, we always give the example of China, but BRICS is not China alone. There are other countries. And it did not necessarily challenge imperialism, but it subverted it from within. So, and this is what actually Nyerere was advocating for. So we have two paths for South-South solidarity. On the one hand, through radical delinking. On the other hand, through subverting imperialism from within. To me, they are both approaches that can be used to build South-South solidarity and do away with neocolonialism. How effective they are, that is subject to discussion. Lastly, the struggle for South solidarity and against neocolonialism is, of course, going to be a very long and protracted struggle, as Nyerere's struggles would show. And always he insisted, giving this example of the proverbial rabbit on a mission to kill the elephant. So, and he says in the end, it managed to kill the elephant, and I hope this inspires us to carry on with the struggle, believing that one day the rabbit will kill the elephant. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was so engrossed in your talk that I completely forgot the timekeeping, but you were within time. So, Skantha-Kumar, we'll have you last, Maria. Okay? Okay. Skantha-Kumar? Yeah.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Let me see if we can get the presentation up. Yeah, so thank you to the organizers for having me. So when you don't have a paper, what you do is you show some pictures. So I'm going to show you some pictures, right? And you can decide later whether there's an argument. But for the moment, I'm going to show a couple of pictures, and I'm also going to, indulge the Sri Lankans who are here, because I'm going to speak a little bit about this place. In relation to Bandung. So those of my generation, or perhaps slightly younger, would recognize this caricature and the artist, Aubrey Collett. So just a couple of things I thought were interesting. First, of course, look at the positioning. Nehru is in the center. Yeah, Nehru is clearly seen as the star, right, of the conference. This is a caricature of the men at Bandung. And you can see to my right, a profile of Chou En-lai. So Chou En-lai is not really in the frame, right? He's kind of on the margin. To Nehru's left is our third prime minister. In his time, and subsequently always an object of ridicule or derision. So he's seen festooned with his medals, which he was fond of wearing. In fact, he had never seen any active service. He was a reservist and decommissioned with the rank of colonel, and subsequently elevated to the rank of general on his deathbed. So I just wanted to just start off with a little bit of that. And I'm sorry that I just couldn't get a clearer picture. And you'll be able to recognize some of the others, right? Nazar in the background, Unu to Nehru's left, yeah. Kotelawala appropriately to Nehru's right. Okay, let's see if I can move this, which, no, as usual, I made the same mistake everybody does. Okay, let me see if we can, no. sorry. No. So I'm so sorry. And which button should I? Yeah. Okay. So what I want to do is to begin with an observation. There is a tendency to parcelize the Bandung Conference and its legacy into whatever is seen as useful for the moment. But this misses the promise and potential. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This misses the promise and potential of what was a rounded an interconnected agenda that included human rights and self-determination, cultural cooperation, and importantly, world peace. Interventions and movements of the present that discard or diminish any of these elements in pursuit of only one of them do disservice to the past and the future. So I want to recall something of the Bandung Conference of Ceylon, or more specifically Sir John Kotelawala, who represented the island, and the differences between the Bandung Communique and the Declaration and Program of Action of the new International Economic Order. So occasions such as this anniversary gathering are occasions to revive memories, but also remake them. And I just wanted to show you two pictures which remake those memories. First is a picture that in fact was used by a daily newspaper to accompany the notice of this particular event. But, well, there is something not quite right about both these pictures in relation to the Bandung Conference. First, and it's a running theme, they're only men. Yes. But the picture on the left includes two men who were never at Bandung. They weren't there. Nkrumah had been advised not to attend. Tito, of course, was excluded because he represented a country in Europe, and this was a Africa-Asia summit. The second one, I didn't crop this picture. The second one is a billboard for the 60th anniversary, 10 years ago. Now the agency cropped the picture. Guess who is to the right in this picture? Guess who's missing from it? Sir John Kotelawala. Right? So the four figures who are here are seen to represent what Bandung was. Sir John is always seen as the oddball, the misfit. So women are missing from this picture, but there were women in 1947 in New Delhi, in 1955 again in New Delhi at a People's Assembly, as well as the several Africa-Asia women's conferences that took place, including one here in Ceylon in 1958. But we are also missing a sponsor of the Bandung Conference, and that is Sir John Kotelawala, who hosted the precursor to it, or not quite, but the Colombo, so-called Colombo Powers Conference of 1954, here in Colombo, and the second part in Kandy. So here's a little historical oddity. So who goes to Bandung? It's the Prime Minister of Ceylon, and the Prime Minister of Ceylon at that point in time is not a leftist, not a nationalist in the sense in which we would recognize Nehru, Nkrumah, Nasser, and so on, but in fact a rightist, an extremely a conservative who was also an anti-communist and reveled in being viewed and seen as an anti-communist. But this anti-communist insisted that the People's Republic of China be invited and present in Bandung. That was not a given. That was not a given because what is now Taiwan occupied or was still seen as recognized as China. The party that this particular individual came from, the party of the right, the party that had ruled Sri Lanka since independence and continued to until just the year after Bandung, was the party that first recognized Communist China at a time in which it lacked that international recognition or even recognition in Asia by signing the Rice Rubber Pact in 1952, just a few years before Bandung. So here you had a leader of the right, a representative of anti-communism, engaging and negotiating with China, along with, of course, other leaders from Western-aligned countries like Philippines, Thailand, and so on. And all of them, including Burma and India, fearful of the communist movement within their states. And it's very difficult now for us to appreciate it, but remember at that point in time, for Nehru, as well as in Burma, and certainly the situation in the Philippines and Thailand, it was the rising left that was seen as a threat to the nationalist regimes, not forces from the right. So I want to pick up on some forgotten memories by reminding everyone, and this too came very strongly from John Kotelawala, that Bandung should be a place to talk about peace. So this is a moment in our region, in our continent, where there was enormous concern about the prospects for a global conflagration, which would be provoked by the conflicts or tensions between the two post-World War superpowers, and the drawing of Asian countries into this through alliances such as the pro-Western Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, SEATO. But this is also a time where, in our region as well as elsewhere, the very recent experience of the devastation caused in the Second World War, a climate of fear around the development of hydrogen bombs, 1,000 times more powerful than the ones dropped not once, but twice on an Asian country, Japan, by the United States. So for these countries, here in our region as well as elsewhere, the concern that this trend towards the development of nuclear weapons and these increasing tensions posed a threat to humanity as a whole. And I wanted to mention this because also of just what has happened in our region in these last few months. Please remember, we are in a sub-region of South Asia where there are two nuclear powers, and those two nuclear powers went to war. They went to war. They remain in a state of war. So at Bandung, what the leaders were also pushing for was the peaceful settlement of disputes between states. That for the countries, the newly decolonized countries of Asia and Africa, to be a force, a moral force for world peace, they had to practice what they were telling the USSR and the USA. So they had to solve their disputes peacefully. They had to not replicate these countries. And this land where we are was one of the countries very vocal in decades past, calling for the Indian Ocean to be a zone, a nuclear-free zone, a nuclear-free zone, a nuclear weapons-free zone. So neutralism, this idea of not being aligned between the rival camps of the USA and the USSR, in Bandung. And as I said, regardless of ideological differences between political ideologies of the left and the right. So I also want to make mention of something else that came up and that also has a resonance today, which is about reform of the United Nations. So remember, at this time, virtually all these countries that came to Bandung were not yet members of the United Nations. In fact, countries like Ceylon didn't become a member till very much later. So they were blocked. They wanted to become members, but they were blocked by opposition from the existing powers. In Ceylon's case, the USSR, because of the presence of British bases on this island. But Sir John actually went further than the final. What I've extracted is from the communique, the Bandung communique. But Sir John went further, and I wanted to make mention of that, which is that he called for the dismantling of the Security Council. He said that you cannot have equality among states if some states have permanent membership and you have the Security Council sort of lording it over the General Assembly. So he was in favor of the abolition of the Security Council. The communique didn't go that far. It was asking, give us a seat at the table, and also asking for equitable representation. So now I want to move on, and I'm coming to the end, to what was in the Bandung communique in relation to economic cooperation. So here I've just picked up, and I've used, excuse me, but I've used sort of contemporary rubrics, right? These are not terms that were known or used in 1955, but I've just taken things that may be a little bit more familiar to our contemporary here, and that is, I've divided into three clusters: South-South cooperation, financing for development, and fair trade. So what you would notice about what's here is that in these areas, I mean, so these are themes that continue to be themes of contemporary discourse, but what you would notice is that there is no attempt within the communique, and in fact at the conference, and this has been commented upon earlier too, to challenge the existing international or the traditional international division of labor, where poor countries, the colonized countries, exported primary, largely agricultural commodities or minerals, and imported manufactured goods from the rich countries, the ex-colonial, the industrialized countries. So these demands remain within, are very mild or moderate, and even the language, you must recall, is deliberately sort of couched in non-confrontational or diplomatic terms. So specifically, it's said there is no intention among the Asian and African countries to form a regional bloc. Let's see. Then they take up the issue of the World Bank. What are they saying? Well, the World Bank ought to give more money to poor countries. Remember, the focus of the World Bank at that point in time was on rebuilding war-devastated Europe. And please note here, there is no opposition to private capital. There is no hostility to private capital. They press that the World Bank should quickly set up the organization that still exists, the IFC, in order to promote these greater capital flows into Asia and Africa, but of course also encouraging support for joint ventures between among Asian and African countries. And then when it comes to fair trade, I mean, it's what we've heard. Again, the focus is on commodities, right? It's about getting better prices for what we produce and a higher return, but it's not really seeing any shift outside of what seemed to be this division of labor. Okay, so now to fast forward, we come to 1974 and to the new international economic order. And here really, in terms of the lineages or trajectories, I mean, to me still, it is not so clear that there is some kind of seamless continuity from Bandung 1955 to New York 1974, but rather to see also parallel processes like the non-aligned movement then chaired by Algeria, which of course summons this special session of the UN General Assembly, where the declaration and program of action is adopted. Of course, along with the non-aligned movement, and this is again just a shout out to the Sri Lankans here, is the establishment of the UN Conference on Trade and Development in 1964. So, of course, we here take pride that the third Secretary General of UNCTAD, 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒅, was of course from this place. Let me at this point pause to just introduce a piece of trivia that none of you would have any interest in, but so there's a connection between 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒅 also and even this space that we are in, which is that as those of you who are not from Sri Lanka have now discovered, this place was built as the venue, as a conference site for the Non-Aligned Movement Summit of 1976 by Sirimava government. But before it was became a construction site, and we had this center and the complex built, it was a 9-hole golf course. So 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒅 was related by marriage through his grandmother, his maternal grandmother, to all three of the prime ministers, the three first prime ministers of Ceylon. So, and he was a civil servant his entire life. So he would leave his office, come here and play a couple of round of golf, and then, of course, go to his home, which is about a kilometer or less away from here. So it's just a little bit of trivia. So the aim of the new international economic order was to restructure international economic relations, to redistribute economic power and benefits in favor of underdeveloped countries, the producers and exporters of primary commodities. And so you can see that it is bolder than Bandung. Permanent sovereignty over one's natural resources, the right of states to form cartels or associations in order to get the best possible price for what they export, to regulate transnational corporations. In other words, yes, corporations are there. They were not trying to send them out, but they were definitely trying to discipline them. Which they lacked then and of course now, and technology transfer, this was also mentioned, and please also note this thing, non-reciprocal trade preferences to developing countries. In other words, to recognize that the same rules couldn't apply to both industrialized and non-industrialized countries, and that the global order needed to recognize what was different, inequitable in that relationship, and address it, repair it for everyone's benefit. Okay, so I'm closing. I'm closing now, Chair. I wanted to just close with some random observations or reflections, which is that Bandung was an event which we honor, including by being here, but it was not a rupture with the global order. An anti-colonialism centered around state sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states of Africa and Asian states, but not an anti-colonialism deepened by anti-imperialism. The epoch of national liberation movements after World War II gave rise to other political imaginaries, and I wish to recall the Organization of Solidarity of the Peoples of Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the Tricontinental Conferences, did see anti-imperialism and the struggle for socialism as necessary for full decolonization and complete freedom. Today we are told to call and tell ourselves of something called the Global South. The Global South is a counterfeit. There is neither unity, nor solidarity, nor collective action, whether in the face of genocide in Gaza or Trump's tariff war. In rich and poor countries alike, there is not one, but 3 or 4 worlds. In the spirit of internationalism and solidarity, and for our collective survival on a burning planet, I wish to reaffirm what Che Guevara insisted on: a united front of the victims of oppression and exploitation. A united front regardless of our geographical location. north, south, east, west. A united front regardless of our social identity. Woman, indigenous, trans. The third world, Vijay Prashad reminds us, was not a place, it was a project. The third worldism centered on states alienated and repressive of the exploited and the oppressed. That third worldism is dead. Long live the third world.
I should never be allowed to chair these sessions because I cannot manage timekeeping. So, my dear, in the spirit of my chaotic time management, the floor is yours.
Well, maybe while we wait for the presentation, the images, I just wanted to, I'm very humbled and so grateful for this invitation and for all the people that made it possible. Just as it was said, I had to travel from very far away to be here. I come from Santiago, Chile, and I am deeply honored to be part of this anniversary. And speaking about the global and enduring resonances of the Bandung spirit, particularly by the experience and the militancy of Chilean feminists. So I wish... Yes, I can.
No, unfortunately, today is a day of computer malfunctions because even the video from Indonesia did not arrive. It was going to be a Zoom presentation, and he was not well enough to do it.
Okay. Then. In 1950, the Chilean poet and Nobel Prize winner, Gabriela Mistral, wrote one of her most powerful non-poetic essays, The Cursed Word. In it, she addressed the urgent need to reclaim the word peace and frame it as a pressing global concern. Unafraid to criticize the indifference of political and literary elites and the impotence of the United Nations, Mistral denounced the failure of world powers to prevent armed conflict and nuclear threats. She concluded forcefully, pacifism is not the sweet jelly some imagine. It stirs in us a fierce conviction that cannot still stir. Let us speak each day, wherever we stand, wherever we walk, until it takes form and gives rise to a militancy of peace, one that fills the heavy, tainted air and purifies it. In an enthusiastic letter to respond to Mistral, Olga Poblete wrote, "The struggle to come will be hard, but the cause is great and the Longing for peace is bringing us together with the millions of Europe, Asia, and Africa. It is bringing to the forefront a universal consciousness that no technology, no international mechanism, no diplomacy has ever succeeded in awakening before. This is the militancy for peace that you call for, and it is already beginning to take shape. For feminists in the Global South, the struggle for peace has long been intertwined with anti-fascist and anti-war resistance, as well as broader efforts towards women's emancipation. Reclaiming peace as a political horizon is not about nostalgia or naive idealism. It is a militant exercise in historical memory and strategic imagination. From the mid-20th century onward, in Chile, a generation of internationalist women leaders forged national liberation, anti-imperialism, development, and feminism into a vision of substantive global peace, deeply inspired by the spirit of Bandung. Following the words that have already been said here of Ruslan Abdulghani, Secretary General of the Bandung Conference, this was a spirit of love for peace, non-violence, non-discrimination, and development for all, without undue interference, but with profound mutual respect. A powerful articulation of this spirit came from Chilean historian, feminist, and political organizer Olga Poblete. Born in Tacna while it was still occupied by the Chilean army after the Pacific War with Peru, her early life was shaped by the aftershocks of war and territorial conflict. As a Marxist historian, she was the first Chilean to write books on the modern history of Africa and Asia, and the first woman to become chair of modern history at the Universidad de Chile. Her pioneering trajectory connecting women's and national liberation movements offers a unique lens through which to understand a strategic socialist and feminist pacifism forged between 1930s and 1990s. Over this half-century, Poblete served as secretary of the Movement for the Emancipation of Women in Chile, BMICH. Founded the Chilean Peace Movement in 1951, was an active member of the World Peace Council and received the Lenin Peace Prize in 1962, and served as the only woman in the organizing committee of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development in 1972 under Salvador Allende's government. After the military coup of 1973, she helped to reunify a feminist movement that played a key role in resisting Pinochet's dictatorship. In alignment with the Bandung spirit, Poblete's pacifism was never merely a call for ceasefire. Rooted in a humanistic principles and materialist analysis, it aimed to expose the structural causes and economic interests behind war and to seek the conditions for a lasting peace. This was the foundation for what she called an independent, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonial foreign policy, with decisive support for people fighting for national liberation and clear, universal image of the problems affecting the third world countries. Poblete's pacifist activism had multiple ramifications, both within and beyond Chile. One pivotal moment in her trajectory occurred in 1945 during her stay in New York whilst pursuing a master's degree at Columbia University. According to her account, it was while living in the US and witnessing the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki that her pacifism and anti-imperialist convictions crystallized. We can trace the roots of her political path farther back to her friendship with feminists like Marta Vergara, Delia de Rouge, and Elena Cafarena, women who made peace and one of the central causes of Chilean feminism. In their 1936 platform, BMICH explicitly linked the struggle against fascism and war to women's emancipation. The two greatest enemies of women and humanity, fascism and war. We will fight against fascism because it deprives women of their most elementary rights, considering them only fit for domestic occupations, and against war because it is an inhuman cruelty that serves only to protect commercial interests. This internationalist feminism nurtured an anti-fascist pacifism rooted in the everyday struggles of women organizing for suffrage, for civil and political rights, worker rights, affordable living, child welfare, and reproductive freedom. In Chile, after years of feminist mobilizations, women won the right to vote in 1949. However, this period also saw a sharp increase of anti-communist persecution fueled by the Truman Doctrine in Latin America. In this climate of repression, BMICH dissolved in 1953. By then, Poblete was already a key leader of the Chilean peace movement. Just a few years before the Bandung Conference, in 1951, people led the Chilean delegation to the Second World Peace Congress in Warsaw, joining 2,065 delegates from over 80 countries. She described enthusiasm for the diversity of the assembly. Attentive to the pulse of history and finely sensitive to it, the delegates already carry in their hearts a scheme of the future, which they have been able to sum up in a marvelous legion without regard to skin color, religious convictions, political ideology, or geographical or social backgrounds. In her report, Peace is Not Expected, It is Conquered, delivered to a full house at Santiago Coliseo's theater on February 4, 1952, Poblete summarized the Congress' key discussions. The most pressing issue was the Korean War, then escalating as the Cold War's critical flashpoint. The Congress condemned external intervention and called for Korean sovereignty as the only path to a peaceful resolution. Secondly, the delegates opposed the rearmament of Axis power from World War II. And third, and most importantly, in Poblete's view, they endorsed a resolution from African delegates stating the violence exercised to maintain peoples in a state of colonial dependency and oppression is a threat to the cause of peace, and we proclaim the right of these people to freedom and independence. This became a cornerstone of Poblete's politics of peace, the conviction that peace is only possible by ending neocolonial domination and the economic dependency of peripheral nations. Towards the end of her life in 1992, Olga Poblete wrote War, Peace, and the People, a book that can be read today not only as a record of her peace activism, but also as a roadmap for contemporary peace building. There, she articulated her vision through what she called the 3 Ds of peace: disarmament, decolonization, and development. Each precondition for imagining a lasting peace, especially in the Third World. The first D, disarmament, aimed to counter the Cold War militarization. The World Peace Council, under this banner, campaigned against the irrationality of military expenditure and promoted the conversion of nuclear facilities for peaceful use. Poblete believed the peace movement needed to awaken popular consciousness, particularly among the working class, who would most clearly see the ties between capitalism and war, between life and peace. As she says, who better than they, the productive workforce in cities, fields, seas, and mountains, those always sent en masse to fight in every war only to be the most mercilessly destroyed and devastated afterwards, who better to understand that peace is not a simple ceasefire, but the very essence of life itself. The second D, decolonization, was grounded in national liberation. For Poblete, a materialist peace project had to distinguish between the military offensive of imperial powers and the armed struggle of colonized people seeking freedom. She maintained that the global expansion of US economic and military control was structurally incompatible with peace. In her prologue to Hernán Ramírez Necochea, History of Imperialism in Chile, she wrote, "To write the history of imperialism is to enter fully into the grand history of our contemporary world, to penetrate its complex of force and interests, to seek the driving motives behind human action today, and to illuminate our own projection into the future." Understanding imperialism was not just a crucial for diagnosing the present, but for imagining alternatives and forging alliances with liberation movements in Vietnam, Guinea, Cuba, and Chile. The third D, development, was for Poblete a fundamental pillar for ensuring the peace was not merely the absence of war, but a condition in which people's material needs were met. People concerns about economic development, the safeguarding of human and natural resources, and the conquest of national independence could not be absent from the peace movement, she said. Her thinking on development was informed by Latin America structuralism and Marxist dependence theory, especially as is articulated through 𝒂𝒂𝒓𝒔 and the UNCTAD III conference held in Santiago in 1972. As a member of the organizing committee, Poblete emphasized that peace required integrating the development of productive forces and agrarian reforms into the national agenda. This materialist vision helps explain the enthusiasm with which Poblete and much of the international peace movement embraced the Chilean road to socialism under Salvador Allende's government. Here we can see Olga Poblete with Salvador Allende. Humanity is a verb that is not only conjugated in the past, but essentially in the future. In a present marked by devastating wars in the Congo and Sudan and the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people, it is urgent to renew and update a materialist and third world conception of peace, one that can confront internalized colonialism, challenge the militarization of our own societies, and affirm that interstate alliances does not mean endorsing governments that oppress their own people. This means reclaiming modernity not as a Western ideal or a lost promise, but as the unfinished project of the Global South's emancipatory alliances. Only then can we resist the neoliberal normalization of indifference, despair, and the accelerated cancellation of the future. Poblete wrote about Bandung, and she said this: "It was the first encouraging sign of the will to lay the foundation of a true peace, and proof that unity in diversity was both real and possible. Bandung was the first expression of the third world as a political subject." Committed to the Bandung spirit, we must return to the archives of pacifist internationalism to reactivate a strategic imagination that, feminist and imperialist at its core, can help us build today South-South cooperation and solidarity against war and planetary devastation. Thanks.
Questions, maybe 3 or 4. I see a question right at the back. Yeah. You can address it to the panelists or in particular, or each of them can answer.
Hello, big thank you to the panelists for the very interesting and provocative presentations.
Louder, please.
Sorry. Thank you to the panelists for the provocative presentations. I've got a question I think I'd like to address to Skandakuma. I really enjoyed the presentation, and I think I would agree with the sentiment that there's basically no Bandung spirit today. the provocation about, let's say, the Global South being counterfeit and the Third World Project being dead, I think those are also very useful to discuss. And I was wondering if you could elaborate further on whether you think the center-periphery dichotomy is still sort of a useful modality for us to think about in terms of organizing social movements. And you were talking about also coalitions of the exploited. So within the current global conjuncture, and we see there's definitely a lack of radicalism in the states driving these projects. So how would you suggest we structure and organize social movements and movements of international solidarity? Is it still worthwhile to have them structure along the lines of peripheral solidarity and so on, or does it need to go beyond that? Thank you.
Yes. There's a.
Thank you so
after
much.
you, there's a woman in the front.
Okay. Shall I go ahead with the question?
Yeah, you go ahead and then we'll.
So thanks a lot for the extremely thoughtful presentations. I just want to, I don't know whether this question is too general. Just would like if a comrade from Africa, if you could shed some, taking a couple of minutes, some key ideas of the book you quoted by Nkrumah on the last stages of imperialism as neocolonialism. If that is possible, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes. Sorry, thank you for that wonderful discussion. My question is also for Mr. Skandakuma. 3 very brief questions. To what extent do you think the Ceylonese premier contributed to the ethos of Bandung? Did he reflect the views prevalent in Ceylon at the time? And thirdly, was it a missed opportunity for Ceylon? Thank you.
I'm not sure who to address this to, because my question is on decolonization in education, so hopefully one of you could tap into that. So typically when we talk of decolonization, people talk about decolonizing the curriculum, so centering indigenous voices and things like that. But I think we need to go beyond that, because it wasn't just a colonial curriculum that was mainstreamed in our countries, but also a colonial model of education itself. So the idea that education only takes place in a school, it's not in your lived realities, it's not in your practice. You go to school, that's where education happens, anything else is not. And the idea that knowledge exists only in an individual, so that's why all the exams are on testing the person. You have to perform in your examination alone, but your real life you are working with other people, and that's really where your performance matters. And even the notion of a curriculum itself, so the colonizers decided these are the things that we want you to know, and these are the only things you will learn and the only things you will be tested on. And we are still, even though we're changing what's in the curriculum, we're still following that same model where some people are deciding this is what people need to learn, and you cannot decide for yourself what you need to learn.
Thank you. Skandakuma, you have to start, and then we will open the floor to the others.
Okay. Thank you very much, Shiran, for that question. I don't have a recipe, of course. I don't think any of us do. I want to apologize for any for the confusion I have sown. I did not mean to suggest that the third world is dead. In fact, I ended with long live the third world. So I was trying to suggest that there is something to reclaim in an identity of being of the third world. But where I'm departing from how it's been used in the past is not to associate it with a geography, but rather, of course, with a class, with a particular location. And how useful center periphery? I mean, the thing is, I think I can't say things in definitive terms, because so much depends upon the specific issue or moment? Where is the contradiction? If the contradiction happens to unfold on the plane of rich countries versus poor and so on, then it could. But see, what we are seeing at the moment doesn't quite suggest that, right? I mean, what's happening is global South countries are there's a stampede to the White House to strike deals which are individual or particular, right? There is no attempt even. Shall we first meet? Shall we first discuss? Shall we see how we can strengthen our negotiating or bargaining position? So I want to start with the actuality of where we are, rather than what we would have liked or desired. The actuality today is that all our states, including, I'm very sorry to say, the one I happen to be now subject of, would rather beat a path to Davos than to remember Bandung. And that is why this country, though it was a sponsor of Bandung, not one peep from anybody about that event. No representation from this present government at this event. But come the spring and Davos, I'm pretty certain they will be there. So I'm sorry I don't have some instant solutions, but I want to recall, I want to make mention of something I think that is happening in Brazil this year, which is a sort of anti-fascist convergence. And that convergence is not only of social movements, of trade unions and peasant organizations and associations of feminists and of others, but also of left sectors, left party governmental sectors. So the PT will be represented, the PSOL will be represented, I'm sure other formations from elsewhere. So no, this is not, in no way am I suggesting something that doesn't see the value or the utility in having states present and particularly the more progressive sectors of the state. But at the same time, I'm just very struck at the fact that we seem to have, we as people's movement seem to have fewer allies, fewer people on our side in positions of power. But I would like my aides here to also respond, because that is a very pertinent question. I feel it's a key question that has been raised. I'm sorry I'm inadequate to responding to it. I hope Sabato and the comrade from Chile will also respond to it. So let me quickly on the question of Ceylon and Bandung. Of course, I'm sorry. Did Sir John represent the sentiments of the people of Ceylon? Well, for those of you again who do not on a regular basis follow the political history of Ceylon, Sir John returns from Bandung triumphant, thinking he's had a great conference, and of course the headlines in all the Western newspapers, particularly the American newspapers, hail him, the voice of Asia. The voice of Asia, of course, being a strident so-called an anti-communist voice. But that's 1955, and come 1956, his party, Sir John and his party, are swept out of power. And you get a government that comes in, which of course is far more in tune or sympathetic to what we would call the Bandung spirit and of course non-alignment. So perhaps that might be the answer to your question, that no, he did not represent. And I mean, of course, this is the after effects of the 1953 Hartal. I mean, it's there is something, no? In 2022 we had the economic crisis. And somehow people just stuck it out and bore it. But come 2024, they wanted to give a good lesson to the parties that had treated us so badly, and they did. And in 1956, the anger that was expressed in our uprising of 1953 was also manifest. So was it? So overall, was it a good conference? Well, yes. I mean. It was a good conference in that it happened. It was a good conference in terms of the representation or participation. It was a good conference in that it was opposed and disliked. In other words, it caused some discomfort to the West, particularly to the U.S. Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. So all those for me are markers that it was quite successful. But interesting, SWRD Bandaranaike. This place is named after the person who came to become Ceylon's 4th Prime Minister, did on several occasions say of Bandung that making reference to it, saying that we the people of Asia, we the people of Asia and Africa, we need an economic Bandung now. So in other words, I think that there was some feeling or that somehow we had done well in a certain front, diplomacy, politics, but not so well when it came to economic cooperation. Sorry for having
thank you. About the question on center and periphery, I think they are still very, in my thinking, very relevant, in the sense that the division between, with the exception of very few so-called global south countries that seem to have broken the glass ceiling, but the rest are still, that division is very clear. When I came here, as I move around, I can see this is typically like Tanzania, like a typical third world country. Even when I bought the books, I bought one book yesterday on the same debates about non-aligned movement in the 90s, the IMF and World Bank. And when I was skimming through the pages, even the questions that are being raised are the same questions that were being raised in Tanzania. So that division is there in the sense that there is transfer of surpluses that are being produced in these countries, extraction of resources from basically peripheral countries to central countries. So in that sense, the division is there. And of course, the global division of finance also. So it's there and it's relevant. I wanted to... So how do we organize in that sense? Probably Aziz would speak more. He's the expert on Samir Amin. But I think when a few years before he died, he wrote an article on the call for the formation of a new international alliance of workers and peoples. So he didn't say that we should abandon national liberation movements. And as Amilcar Cabral, who was national liberation leader in Guinea, Bissau and Cape Verde, said so long as imperialism continues to exist, then independence should only mean a national liberation movement in power. So when we speak about peoples, then the whole question of organizing along nationalist lines is still relevant, but also of workers, that is along class lines. And for countries that spent a lot of resources, shed blood in the fight of independence, it's something that we should guard with pride. So I think we should start from where Samir Amin ended, in terms of if we need to organize, then it's along both lines, on the lines of class, but also along nationalist lines. But of course, under the Bandung spirit, as we have presented. On the question of the book by Nkrumah, I think it represents actually Africa's contribution to the advancement of Marxism. As we if you have read Capital, in Capital, Marx theorized capitalism as basically a self-contained system nationally. It took scholars like Rosa Luxemburg to say actually it was not self-contained. Capitalism was dependent on primitive accumulation from non-capitalist countries. And scholars from Africa later, the likes of Samir Amin, but also Nkrumah, and the likes of Nyerere, but in this case Nkrumah, his work was very crucial, because even when Lenin was writing imperialism the highest stage of capitalism, he also predicted that after, capitalism was digging its own grave by going imperialist. But then, just as Marx was saying that, as the exploitation advances, there will be revolutions happening in central countries. In the center, it didn't happen. It actually happened in the weakest link. And then, of course, Lenin predicted that, after capitalism goes imperialism, all these, rebellions from colonies would cause the collapse of imperialism. It didn't happen. That's what Nkrumah is actually saying, that imperialism has taken even a higher stage, that of neocolonialism. So the physical departure of the colonial power didn't necessarily destroy the structures that were there. So that's what he calls neocolonialism. It's a neocolonialism. So where you don't have a colonial power in place politically, but the economic structures are still intact, and the extraction of wealth and resources from ex-colonies to metropolitan countries continues to exist. So it's an advancement of Lenin. But of course he also predicted that it is weak and it's going to collapse, and I think history has shown that it even mutated to an even more dangerous and decadent phase, which is neoliberalism, and that's the beast that we are still grappling with, and it's our duty to bring it down. On the question of decolonization, I think I agree with you. It's time to go beyond the curriculum, but also the idea of school. And I wanted to basically, I mean, my friend is coming from Latin America. She should be in a position to talk about that. But the work of Paulo Freire on pedagogy of the oppressed, but also of Julius Nyerere on education for self-reliance, actually speak about education beyond the school and beyond the curriculum and beyond, the traditional delivery of knowledge in which the teacher is assumed to be, the reservoir of knowledge, and they taught the students as people who are bankrupt, and the teacher is going to deposit knowledge on them, and they want us to go beyond that. In which case, actually, we can have different schools beyond the school, in which methods of producing knowledge, delivering knowledge, are different based on these works. So I also encourage, as part of of building South-South solidarity, to read all these materials. Especially, of course, I know Freire is very popular, but Nyerere, in this case, Education for Self-Reliance, is also very useful in this debate. Thank you so much.
Yes, I want to start by addressing the question on education. But also saying that, for instance, the case of Olga Poblete for me is very interesting because she was also a teacher. And as part of her internationalist militancy and her commitment with South alliances, she wrote 2 books of modern history of Africa and of Asia, and she wrote them in Chile because she knew that it was very important for students to get to know directly those processes of liberation, of colonization, and to understand how, even though it seemed they were so far away from our reality in Chile, they weren't such, no? So I really think of course, it's more than the curriculum, but it's also very important to understand what are the contents that are available and how we can also engage in how transforming the education and transforming the ways we can relate to each other and get to know South realities, because they were saying before that we don't know each other as much. It's so important to recognize those examples of that try to make, for instance, the experience from Chile relate to what was going on in Vietnam, in China, in South Africa, etc. And it's also interesting because she was also she tried to put the experience of women also in the center of those experiences, of an understanding it's not like something that happened, the process of women's emancipation was not only something going on parallel to these processes, but also within them. So that's also something that's, I guess, very interesting to discuss with the idea that these are processes, that this might be intention. And I also wanted to address the idea of how nowadays in Latin America, and particularly in Chile, we're going back to reread, for instance, the Marxist dependency theory, and how important for us is to learn from what was from Teotonio dos Santos, Vania Bambira, Rui Mauro Marini, and Sofaleto, and the work of those who actually, within the process of the unity, of the popular unity, during Salvador Allende's government, they were also building a radical thought that was also was cancelled after the Pinochet's coup in 1973. And it's very important to understand how this was a very politically interested, how they cancelled this, and even in the universities, people, they wouldn't show this as a pertinent theory to read our reality and our contemporary reality. And nowadays, we can see how this dependency has deepened, and how technologically, how commercially, how our countries are, we cannot actually think of them outside the idea of how they respond to very of a general idea of dependency. So I really think it's important to how we look backwards, not in a nostalgic point of view, but how we can learn from those radical thinkers to address to this contemporary and multilateral and neoliberal context.
Thank you very much. I have a feeling that I have really eaten into your lunchtime. Can one of the proper timekeepers signal to me whether we have time for more questions or whether we have to stop for lunch? Ahila? They all disappeared. Yeah? Okay, that says it all. Thank you. I apologize again for my terrible time.
I think we started this session late, so I think it's not, don't take all responsibility for yourself.
But we will have conversations over lunch and when we come back again. Please tell me the time that we should start rounding people up to return.
So the first thing to say about lunch, there is lunch for everybody in what is called the Orchid Room, which is in the main part of the BMICH. If there are BCIS colleagues, can you stand up?